Hello there and welcome to JJ Painting. I am JJ. What do we do on this channel? What on earth do we do on this here channel? Well, we talk about the hobby, of course. Sometimes it's reviews of codexes or novels, we talk about the lore, we talk about the evolution of the hobby and we look at it retrospectively, we do Drunken Explains. There's all kinds of stuff, and I think someone commented in a recent video, why do I always explain what the channel is at the beginning of the video? Well, because it's just good to do that, just so everyone knows what they're going to get, and hopefully the title of the video gives you some idea for that as well. But in any case, Chaos Space Marines. Chaos Space Marines. Boy, is that a controversial topic all of the time. Depending on who you ask and what you say to people, some people dismiss them out of hand, some people lament for days gone by, some people think they're actually alright as they are, but it's a very divisive topic when it comes to any of the factions. Almost uniquely as well. You could talk about Necrons, Drukhari, Astra Militarum, any other faction, no one's that divided about them, but Chaos Marines always seem to really get people going. And today we're going to talk about why that might be. And obviously for today's miniature, we're going to be painting this model right here. Indeed, yes, very chaotic. But in any case, let's talk about some Chaos Space Marines. So for those of you who are in the hobby pre-2007, you will probably remember the Chaos Space Marine Codex 3.5, which is unequivocally remembered as the best ever Chaos Space Marine Codex. Now, we'll get to why I'm not entirely sure if that's accurate in a second, but let's start with why it was so popular. So, the thing you have to remember about that codex is that in many respects it was way ahead of its time when you actually go back and look at it. It had Legion traits and specialist units for every single Chaos Legion. It even had special units for things such as the Alpha Legion, believe it or not. They were the only ones that had access to cultists for a long time. It opened up things to every part of... It opened up access to different things for different legions, so Iron Warriors could have Imperial Guard Basilisks, the Word Bearers could have demons as allies in a really large number, and obviously it had customizability and a huge amount of equipment and war gear and upgrades and artifacts and stuff we would recognize as such in today's codex. And in fact, if you go back and read the 3.5 Chaos Space Marine Codex, and just to clarify here, that was the second codex they had in 3rd edition, just like we currently have 8.5 in the Chaos Space Marine Codex today. If you go back and look at it today, it looks very much and reads in many respects very similarly to a lot of codexes that we have nowadays, including all the things that come across as maybe a little bit overcomplicated, but that's a different subject for a different time. So, if we go back and look at why it was so strong, obviously all the things that I mentioned before, but the other things that made it really strong as well was the vast customization and customability of every unit and every model, that you could shape your Chaos Lords and your champions to be as strong or as powerful as you needed them to be for certain things. But there were a few drawbacks to this codex, and the most important one was you needed a calculator to figure out how your units worked. Because you've got to remember that back in those days, Demon Princes didn't actually have a datasheet or even a stat line. Yes, that's right, the Demon Prince was not actually its own stat line. You either took your Sorcerer or your Chaos Lord, and you had to figure out all the additions to their weapon skill, strength, toughness, attacks, leadership, etc. And that's how you figured out what your Demon Prince's stat line was, which even now, thinking back at it, was pretty crazy. But looking at it today, it was utterly insane. And you have to remember, this was the same codex that Plague Marines, Rubric Marines, Noise Marines, and Khorne Berserkers did not have stat lines either. You had to figure out how the marks and the equipment would affect the stat line in order for your regular Chaos Marines to then count as those units. And this brings me on to one of the key differences between the codexes of today and the codexes of back then, is there was a very much greater level of customization on the actual stat lines. There were fewer stat lines overall, but there were a lot of things you could buy in points to adjust the stat lines, rather than every model just having its own datasheet and its own set of rules that was separate from other things. And so that's one of the things to remember. But obviously it's still remembered incredibly fondly by people who were in the hobby back then, and this is also one of the reasons why Chaos Marines have struggled ever since in some people's opinions, but not in mine, and we'll get to that now. So the immediate codex that came afterwards in 2007, the Chaos Space Marine Codex then, did two things that was very unpopular. The first thing it did is it swept all of that Chaos Legions, all of the Mark stuff, everything out the door in a lot of respects. So Alpha Legion lost their cultists, the Raptors lost access to having their Night Lords, the Word Bearers lost their Dark Apostles, and yes, there were Dark Apostles before there were Dark Apostle models, believe it or not. Iron Warriors lost access to things like Basilisks, and a lot of other stuff was taken out of that codex in a very sudden way. And you have to remember that if you were playing Chaos Marines, even for a few years, you did have very detailed and very customized armies. And for a lot of people playing those armies, suddenly they just did not have access to those things anymore. And what was equally a problem was what happened to the demons. All the demons, Bloodletters, Plague Bearers, Demonettes that we know today, and the Greater Demons were in the Chaos Marine Codex, and all of that was suddenly gone. It would only be 12 months or so from that point, thankfully, before we saw the next Demon Codex, but to be honest with you, it did take a couple of years for the demons to find their feet in their own codex, but that's another story entirely. And the thing you have to remember about how Chaos Marines worked is very different to how they work today. So what you've probably heard me talk about the marks and the legions is that there was more. You have to remember that back then, you bought marks in your points cost for each of your units, and just like today, most units in the Chaos Space Marine Codex had access to the marks of Chaos. But the difference is that back then, every single mark had access to a specific stat line altering thing. So your mark of Khorne would unsurprisingly give you 1 extra attack, the mark of Nurgle, unsurprisingly 1 extra toughness, mark of Tzeentch would give you an invulnerable save, mark of Slaanesh would boost your initiative, as it was known back then, but obviously that's not a thing anymore, so that manifests quite differently nowadays. But ultimately, the thing that made these units special was down to the marks, not to the legions. The legions just added extras to those. And if we fast forward quickly to 9th edition and to 8th edition, the marks are actually secondary now to the legion traits, and we'll get to why that's actually surprisingly complicated and maybe doesn't work the best for Chaos Marines the way it works for Space Marines shortly. But just to quickly surmise, if we go back to the early origins of the Chaos Space Marines and their earlier codexes, to have such a big and such a customizable and such a rich codex in 1 year, and then for it to very suddenly become a very bare-bones minimalist affair, was one of the biggest shocks to the system. And yes, granted, Chaos Marines did in some respects become more open. You no longer had to take a Chaos Lord aligned to a specific Chaos God to take units from with other marks as troop choices. You were no longer limited to things such as Obliterators or Defilers, which you were before. And these are things which were limited in the previous codex, but obviously weren't in the following codex. But that was a trade-off which didn't feel like it sat quite well with people who were playing Chaos before then. So that's something to bear in mind going forward. And obviously this is the codex that was very firmly established for both 4th and for 5th edition. So whilst this was going on for quite some time, this codex did have quite a long shelf life going from 2007 to 2012. And you have to remember that in this time, the Space Marines started seeing chapter tactics, albeit in a very limited respect, starting to come in. The Imperial Guard and the Eldar had craft, world and regiment abilities come and go. So there was quite a big change in terms of streamlining 40k at this time to simplify it, but ultimately in retrospect, it oversimplified. So for Chaos Marines, who were one of the early victims of this oversimplification, they really did suffer, and arguably you could still say that they're still playing catch up to where they were before. But obviously you have to remember that back then there was far less in the Chaos Marine Codex as well. This was, like I said, in the time before the 4 key god-specific units had their own traits. There was no Scarab Terminators, there was no Blightlord Terminators, obviously there was no Demon Prince, there were definitely no Demon Primarchs, there were no Mutilators, there was no Forge Fiend, Mauler Fiend or Helldrake. These things were all years and years away, even in the 2007 codex for the Chaos Marines. So obviously the codex felt like it was emptier and it had been stripped down in a lot of ways. And this is one of the important things to remember when we go from the 5th edition codex to the 6th edition codex. The 6th edition codex started to reintroduce some things. It gave them more psychic powers because psychic abilities were becoming more prevalent in 40k, whereas before they'd always felt like a bit of an add-on. Chaos Lords with certain marks were starting to become a bit more specific in terms of what they could do. This was the beginning of the time of relics and warlord traits being introduced to 40k as well. So things that we would recognise today starting to appear in the 6th edition codex did allow it to take some steps forward, but at the same time there were still limitations to it. For one thing, Chaos Space Marines have always had one very heavy criticism hanging over them, and that's their price. They are more expensive than regular Space Marines, and they always have been. That's only changed recently because Space Marines have 2 wounds now, but most Chaos Marines, at time of recording at least, still only have 1 wound, and that's a much bigger deal. And obviously the thing about the legions of Chaos Space Marines that are different to the Space Marine chapters is that even though the Space Marine chapters are far more broad and there's a lot more of them because of the second foundings as well, the Chaos Marines were always forced to share space. If we look over at the early years of the Space Marine codexes, so you had the Dark Angels, Space Wolves, Grey Knights, Black Templars, etc. codexes, and how they've now evolved into the supplements, they've always been given more space. They haven't had to shove everything into one book. And it wasn't until towards the end of 2017, if we get ahead of ourselves for a second, that we started to see things like the Thousand Suns and the Death Guard getting space in their own codexes, which obviously gave them room to breathe. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, and we'll get to all that very shortly. But to very quickly summarise what we've covered so far, obviously the 3rd edition Codex, or 3.5, the change to 4th was a big shock to the system. And even though there were some less limitations, the amount of stuff that was taken out of the Codex made the bare bones Codex feel very empty by comparison. And when we got to 6th edition, whilst there were stuff that was still coming back into it that worked for 6th edition, it wasn't quite the same as 3.5. However, I would argue that the 6th edition Codex for Chaos Space Marines was probably one of the strongest they've ever had. And the reason I say that is twofold. First of all, as I said before, they started to get things like relics, warlord traits, and psychic powers that were specific to each of the gods, way ahead of a lot of other armies having different disciplines. And the other thing you have to remember is that the way psychic abilities worked back then, and that the way the old wounding system worked, is they had access to quite a lot of things that gave them a bigger advantage than Space Marines. You have to remember that this was at a time where they could have 3-man Terminator squads rather than a minimum of 5 in the Chaos Space Marine army. Their Psykers actually had access to more psychic powers and could cast more psychic powers than Space Marine Psykers could. So even though there was a points difference, they definitely had their advantages. But the points difference obviously as well comes into it when we then look at the things they had that Space Marines didn't have, such as the Demon Engines. And unfortunately, the Demon Engines have only recently started to get the upgrades and the power boost they need in the form of being Ballistic Skill 3 rather than Ballistic Skill 4. And the big problem with Demon Engines being Ballistic Skill 4 is that it's the price of the model. So a Leman Russ for the Imperial Guard puts out more shots than most Demon Engines, and they're also a lot cheaper and arguably quite a bit more resilient, having a higher frontal armor in the old system and having more wounds in the new system. And what that's always meant is that you have Demon Engines that cost more than a Leman Russ, putting out less shots and being more brittle. Now, that was a problem in 6th, 7th, and 8th edition. And now that we're in 9th edition, now we've seen the Thousand Suns and Death Guard get that upgrade, that's been a massive help. So that's something else to bear in mind, that the things that were quote-unquote unique to Chaos Marines were also not particularly specific to any of the legions or to the gods either. So any Chaos Marine army can take Mauler Fiends or Forge Fiends or Helldrakes under the 6th, 7th edition codexes, and that's everything from Death Guard to Thousand Suns to Word Bearers to Night Lords to Alpha Legion could have access to all of these. But because being a part of that legion, or even having access to certain any of the gods, didn't make any change to how the models played or how the gameplay was directly affected. All of that meant that you were effectively having the same stuff just across the board in a different colour scheme. Now, things like Chaps Tactics for Space Marines have fixed that, but obviously this was a time before vehicles were really included. So yes, you could give all of your infantry the Mark of Nurgle and they'd have their boosted toughness, or give them all the Mark of Tzeentch and have an invulnerable save. But it didn't do anything for the vehicles, which was always a bit of an oversight and was always a bit weird. But ultimately, it's good to see that in some respects that has sort of been readdressed now, even if it may not go quite as far as we'd want. So just to very quickly recap, even though 6th edition did start to bring in things that definitely gave the Chaos Marines their edge, it wasn't applied in a manner that felt like any one Chaos Marine legion or any one part of the Chaos Marines was becoming more unique or becoming more special or starting to operate in a way that we hadn't seen them operate before, that was so different or so specific to the legions that it could stand up on its own. But then, of course, there was the Traitor Legion supplement, which was very nearly the thing that saved Chaos Space Marines in the eyes of many. And had it not been for the 8th edition train coming around the corner, it probably would have been the thing to give Chaos Marines the edge that they had needed for years. Now, between that and the Wrath of Magnus, they were the things that gave Chaos Marines two very special things. First of all, in the existing Chaos Marine Codex, most units could have a mark to one of the Chaos Gods. But then there were the Legion-specific special rules, and that was a huge deal. And it was a huge deal because it meant that you had two bonuses on your Chaos Space Marines. Not only did they have a Legion trait, they also had the abilities that being either dedicated to Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, or Slaanesh granted as well. And this was a really brief period. And it's one of those things which, even in 7th edition, people were very excited to see, and it did bring a lot of people back to Chaos Marines who hadn't really been engaging with it since the fall of the 3.5 Codex. And that's a really important thing to remember going forward. And then this brings me on to 8th edition and the codexes that we've had for the past couple of years. And the first thing I think it's worth saying about the codexes that you can probably see is going to change is that when the switch from 7th edition to 8th edition happened for Chaos Marines, people were expecting something similar to Space Marines, and that's unfortunately what we got. We got Legion traits the way they got chapter traits, and I say that was unfortunate for one massive reason. It was unfortunate because that's all Chaos Marines got. Yes, the Death Guard and Thousand Suns got their own codexes, so they got a whole new set of rules and new models and new ways of playing that were completely different to Chaos Space Marines. But ultimately, Space Marines were very different to Chaos Marines on a fundamental basis, and that's something which has never really been fully embraced, apart from in that 3.5 codex. And this is the thing to bear in mind. This is what all of this has been leading to in retrospect and thinking back onto it now. Space Marines and Chaos Marines shouldn't be played the same way. If you're playing Space Marines, there's a lot of ways to play them, depending on your chapter tactics, depending on how you want to run the army, but those ways aren't necessarily a copy and paste with Chaos Marines. And that's something which I think has really let down the Chaos Marine Codex over the years, is effectively trying to copy too much from the Space Marine Codex. Yes, in the current codexes, there are some things which Chaos Marines definitely have that Space Marines don't have. Obliterators spring to mind. Demon Engines are another one that I've mentioned before. But ultimately, a lot of the stuff that when you look at the structuring, the way they are focused, the sort of way the units are laid out is very similar. And I think it's been very much a point in the favour of Thousand Suns and Death Guard that they've moved away from that with the Plague Marines and the Rubric Marines, as well as their Terminators. It's much easier to see how the Chaos Marines could look from the perspective, as I said in one of my other videos, when we look at how Death Guard and Thousand Suns have distanced themselves more and more from the Chaos Marine Codex. And in many respects, you could not play a Space Marine army from the Word Bearers or the Night Lords or the World Eaters the way you would play Death Guard or Thousand Suns. And speaking of the Legions, let's get onto the specifics of those. So whilst there were Legion traits that obviously gave every model in the army a certain boost, the one thing they didn't then give them was the god traits as well. So being dedicated to one of the Chaos Gods used to have tangible advantages in-game, and these things could be quite far-reaching and would apply to all your models equally. You have to remember there was a point where you could boost your bikes with the Mark of Nurgle to toughness 6, or you could have Raptors with a 5-up invulnerable save, or if you wanted to, you could have Obliterators with an extra attack. That was all very valid and very good. Now, obviously the Legion traits have fulfilled that in some respects with the World Eaters, but as for the rest of the range, those god-specific traits have not carried over. In fact, if you dedicate your army to one of the Chaos Gods, all you get out of it is a keyword and maybe a stratagem and a psychic power. That's it. You don't get any bonuses directly to your units, and I think that's one of the big things that Chaos Marines really lack, and that's what makes it feel like they're a little bit anemic next to Space Marines. The second wound is almost an afterthought at that point, when you take away the fact that the thing that was a cornerstone of Chaos Space Marines for most of their history doesn't apply to them in 8th and 9th edition, and I think that's one of the things that really hurts them. So just a quick summary on the points we've covered. The transition from 7th to 8th and then into 9th was huge for every army, but for Chaos Space Marines, it saw them gain with one hand but lose with the other. And whilst we saw some of the legions leaving the Chaos Space Marine Codex and start to forge their own path, which has been very good and very exciting for them, the rest of the Chaos Space Marines arguably have been left in the same place. Because if I was to say, what has really changed for the World Eaters, or what has really changed for the Word Bearers or the Night Lords, yes, they have their own stratagems, yes, they have some of their own characters, but the Chaos Space Marine Codex was emptied of all the things that the Thousand Suns and Death Guard were bringing in there, but there was nothing really there that really filled the space. And I think one of the things about the Chaos Legions that the Space Marine chapters have discovered is that they work better when they're given space to expand elsewhere. Yes, in Psychic Awakening, we did see them get some stratagems, some Warlord traits, and that was all very useful. Oh, and relics, obviously, which was nice. But obviously that then leaves the question of why didn't they get their own codex? And this kind of brings me on to my final point, is that what would be the best direction for Chaos Space Marines now? And why are they a hot mess now? And is it fair to call them a hot mess now? And the conclusion to that is, I don't know. But when I say I don't know, is in to say I don't know where that I sit on it. What I mean is to say, is it fair to call them a hot mess? If you look at the Chaos Marine Codex, there are some things in there which are still very powerful. Possessed, Bikes, Terminators, Obliterators are all really useful. A few clever stratagems in the right place can still yield fantastic results, and obviously the creations of Bile have given Chaos Marines a whole new lease on life, arguably. But then again, that's only parts of the Codex. That's not the Codex as a whole, and I think this is the thing. Half of the Chaos Marine Codex feels incredibly strong and incredibly competitive, for want of a better word, and quite compelling. But the other half is barely worth looking at in the eyes of most people, and unfortunately that half tends to be filled up mostly with the stuff that was the original draw of Chaos Marines, and that is Space Marines corrupted and empowered by the powers of Chaos, but in gameplay terms, if anything, they have been depowered because the powers of Chaos aren't that present in their codex, and that's what I think that lets them down. So, I think that sums up my thoughts on the Chaos Space Marines, but what do you guys think? Do you think the Chaos Space Marine Codex is powerful as it is? Do you think it needs a massive shake-up? And if so, what kind of shake-up does it need? So those are my thoughts as to why the Chaos Space Marines are the way they are. And let me know what you guys think down below in the comments. And whilst you're down there, like, subscribe, all that good YouTube shilly stuff. I post my videos on Wednesdays and Fridays. And whilst you're down there in the comments, check out my website to see what my services I provide. Have a look at my Patreon if you want to support, and even just my Instagram if you want to look at some pictures of toy soldiers. But again, thank you all very much for joining me. Goodbye, and have a lovely day.